The final decade of the country before the Civil War was one in which you had a host of issues in addition to the situation between the free and the slave states, especially that of immigration, which was really catching on by the late 1840s and the early 1850s, and then women's movements, followed by the election of 1852, a new set of leaders for America, and the Pierce administration. Here you see a anti-immigration poster showing the ape-like Irishman called a Paddy and the equally animalistic Oriental devouring Uncle Sam as they come closer and closer, and then they devour each other to look like each other along the way. The late 1840s and the early 1850s was a period of massive immigration. In 1848, there were revolutions that broke out all throughout Europe: France, Germany, Austria, Ireland. And in addition to that, you had a complete failure of the potato crop in Ireland. This was not a famine because there was plenty of food in Ireland. This was an enforced starvation by the British government based on ideology and upon pure spite and evilness. And so you had a great deal of immigration to the United States. Irish came in on cotton ships that delivered cotton to England, then would carry Irish immigrants back. And these cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Savannah, Charleston, and New Orleans became choked with immigrants living in shabby tenements. And because of this great influx of immigrants, you had nativist movements. The Know-Nothings, called so because whenever they perpetrated violence against immigrants, were often believed to say, "We know nothing about what is going on," called themselves officially the American Party. And their main target was intimidating and oppressing Irish immigrants, especially in Philadelphia, but not so much in New York, because the Irish community in New York threatened massive retaliation if any priests or churches would be burned down. Many of these nativist movements were xenophobic. They were anti-Catholic. They believed that slavery was a secondary issue, argued for longer naturalization times, argued for the exclusion of Irish from certain jobs. In fact, you saw the signs oftentimes on windows, "Help wanted, no Irish need apply," or that would also be in newspaper job listings. Nativist movements were very much akin to what you see going on today, as they argued that these new immigrants, being Catholic, were beholden to foreign religious leaders. They were not able to be assimilated into the American culture. They were simply not of American Protestant Christian values and so forth, which, of course, reflects what we are going through today. This chart here shows the massive spike in immigration all the way up to the Civil War, and then you notice the major drop-off during the Civil War. The picture there shows the very scraggly, bum-like Irishman with the dome of a Catholic church like St. Peter's reading a sign. You notice that when he comes back to the United States, he then becomes Americanized and is able to become part of the American Protestant culture. The 1840s and the 1850s were times of great women's movements. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton called the Seneca Falls Conference in Upper New York State. The conference featured seminars in women's education, called for equal rights, and almost as an afterthought at the end, they decided to call for suffrage. They were largely ignored by Congress, but it represented the growing diversity, but also the growing fracture of American society. But this is where the women's movement in America begins. And oftentimes during the last election in 2016, Secretary Clinton often made reference to the Seneca Falls Conference, as did many other women leaders throughout this country. In the election of 1852, the Whig Party, now on its last legs, bypassed Fillmore, who they believe had sold the country out with the Compromise of 1850, and did not even nominate him. Instead, they chose Winfield Scott, another war hero, just like Zachary Taylor. The Democrats chose Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire, also a Mexican war hero. He was called a doughface, because even though he was from New Hampshire, he had tremendous pro-Southern sympathies. As a matter of fact, he was very close friends with Jefferson Davis, who he would make his Secretary of War in his administration, and Pierce wins the election. Franklin Pierce, however, proves to be a very, very less than mediocre president, part and parcel of the fact that he was a very bad alcoholic, and there were reasons for that. What you're seeing with Pierce and others is that there's a new set of leaders in America. Calhoun, Clay, and Webster and their generation have gone, and now it's left to those like Stephen Douglas, Thaddeus Stevens, William Seward, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, Jefferson Davis, who was a Secretary of War and then a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, and Abraham Lincoln, who will make a famous run for the Senate in the year 1858. Franklin Pierce's administration was often criticized as being timid and uncertain, and Pierce himself was simply a man not up to the tasks of the day. He was overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. He did manage to have the Gadsden Purchase, and as a president, he had actually a rather strong foreign policy. At one time, they advocated seizing Cuba by force. This was called the Ostend Manifesto, which says that the United States should go after Cuba. However, many in Congress said no, because Cuba was populated by too many Afro-Cubans, and they did not want more blacks coming in to, quote-unquote, dilute the whiteness of the country. Franklin Pierce also sent Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan in 1853. Matthew Perry was the younger brother of Oliver Hazard Perry from the War of 1812, and he essentially held Japan's head to gunpoint and said, you now need to open up your borders to trade with the West, because Japan was a very medieval nation and it closed itself off for 200 years. And so the Japanese do this, open it up, but somewhat reluctantly. But the Japanese begin to modernize very quickly. However, and this is important, some 88 years later, the Japanese would extend a measure of revenge on the West. Here you see the rather haunted look of Franklin Pierce, a very handsome man, but he and his wife had suffered the loss of a child in a terrible accident, and they really never got over it. And so he was a rough drinker, but he allowed Davis and others in his administration to really run the show for him. Pierce is actually a direct ancestor of U.S. President George W. Bush from his mother's side. Here are some of the new leaders. In the upper left is Thaddeus Stevens. That head of hair that he has there, that's actually a wig. He was bald, cue-bald. On the lower right is Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, often given to very long, bloviating speeches on the floor of the Senate and could be very insulting to people. He was very haughty and very arrogant, and this would get him in trouble more than once. The upper left is the very dour Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, of the Chase family, financial wizards, and he would serve later as Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury in his administration, and then later as Supreme Court Chief Justice. The lower right is William Henry Seward, who would later serve as Lincoln's Secretary of State during the Civil War, and then Johnson's Secretary of State after that. On the left is a very young-looking Jefferson Davis, and on the right is Abraham Lincoln, actually 1 year younger than Davis. the big burr in the side of the Pierce administration was the Kansas-Nebraska territory. In 1854, territory to the north of and west of Missouri was created and called Kansas-Nebraska. In it, both territories would be allowed to submit themselves to popular sovereignty, which meant that the people there would vote to determine whether or not they were going to be slave or free. This now at last ends the Missouri Compromise once and for all. But the problem is that you had two factions in there, this pro-slave and the anti-slave faction. The pro-slavers came from Missouri, and the governor of Missouri had told them to be Kansans for a day, to go over and vote for slavery. Meanwhile, you had anti-slavery forces. They were called Jayhawkers. That's where Kansas University gets its nickname from. Fighting broke out. There was a massacre near Lawrence, Kansas, where the University of Kansas is now located. And this led John Brown, who was an ardent abolitionist, a religious fanatic as an abolitionist, to assault a town called Pottawatomie on May 26, 1854. And as a result of this, the residents who were pro-slavery were massacred there by John Brown, who didn't just use guns, they used broadswords to hack the people to pieces. Kansas's pro-slave forces met at a town called Lecompton and passed a constitution that they submitted to Congress to allow Kansas to come in as a slave state. Congress did not accept this constitution, and so therefore Kansas would not become a state until 1861, and then it would come in as a free state. And here you see a map of the United States, a political map of the United States, showing right dead square in the center, Kansas and Nebraska. Kansas in white, Nebraska north of that in green. This map here shows the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory as it was divided in 1854. That is a picture of John Brown. John Brown in his younger days. John Brown was one of those who believed that he was God's instrument on earth as an abolitionist to end slavery by whatever means possible, including armed rebellion. He and his sons did quite a bit of slaughtering in their time. The violence was not just out in the Kansas Territory, it was actually on the floor of the U.S. Congress itself. Charles Sumner, who I told you, the U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, gave a very long speech in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Territory, in which he criticized heavily the senior senator from South Carolina and began to make fun of him for drooling because the senator had suffered a stroke. Well, over in the House of Representatives was the senior senator's cousin, Preston Brooks of South Carolina. Well, Preston Brooks, wanting to avenge his cousin's honor, took a brass-handled stick over to the Senate and assaulted Sumner while he was sitting in his desk and began to hit him with the brass end of the stick, fracturing Sumner's skull, lacerating him, while Southern senators kept the other senators from breaking it up, saying this was a matter of honor between gentlemen. Well, of course, the Northern press has excoriated Preston Brooks and the people of South Carolina. Meanwhile, the people of South Carolina and several throughout the South began to send him new canes with brass handles on it.